Right, welcome back and thank you for staying with us. So it's our focus this morning. South Africa is no stranger to coalition politics, but the question we're asking this morning is why they're failing in contemporary South Africa. Political instability has been the hallmark of the city of Johannesburg in particular in recent years. The city has been governed by the ANC, a DEA coalition, and now Al-Jamaa. Mayor Tshepo Matseba has been sworn in this morning. So what does this mean for stability and governance? And is Joburg still a world-class African city? Well, let's discuss this further. We're joined by elections analyst Wayne Sussman, as well as reputation expert Tshepo Matseba. Mr. Sussman, I want to just start with you very quickly. I mean, you've been looking at coalition governments with eNCA for quite some time, since the elections actually back in November 2021. What I'm interested in is if we should look at changing legislation when it comes to coalitions, because what we're seeing happening in the city of Johannesburg surely isn't what the mandate was from the electorate.
Good morning. So as soon as a party doesn't get more than 50% of the seats, all bets could be off. But I don't think anyone, as you said at the start of the show, at the start of the segment, anticipated that the party which received the 9th most amount of votes in the city of Johannesburg would end up in the mayoral seat, and the party which received the 15th most amount of votes would end up in the speaker's chair. I study coalitions very carefully in South Africa and in many other parts of the world, and this is a unique situation. And again, when people queued in the lines, whether they're in the suburbs or in the informal settlements or in the inner city or in the townships in early November 2021, I don't think bar his family and select parts of Johannesburg, did people ever anticipate that Tshepo Matseba would become the mayor of Johannesburg. So this is a very unique scenario, and maybe we do need to think what can be done better in this regard. Maybe there needs to be legislation with regards to a minimum qualifying criteria to serve in a council, like 1 or 2% of the vote. That is something we could possibly look at.
Yeah, I think so too. And I'm going to come back to you because Al-Jamaa, I understand, has 1 seat in council and today is leading Johannesburg. And I want to come to you, Ntate Matseba, in terms of the slogan, a world-class African city. That's the slogan for the city of Johannesburg, right? But is it still the case with leadership changing so many times in the last, 4 months?
Yeah, the city of Joburg has faced a very difficult time in the last 4 months, and beyond that, actually, you could probably say the city has faced difficulties in the last 3 years. The brand promise world-class African city cannot be fulfilled when you have such leadership instability, when you have such a shaky environment, because investors, to make it that world-class African city, investors are looking for predictability. And this level of uncertainty tells you that we can't actually say to investors that the environment from a policy point of view and project and implementation of strategic projects from infrastructure, from the energy sector, healthcare, education, and that you can't actually say to investors that the environment is predictable, because you actually have no idea what's going to happen. We don't know. And then you have the current environment where we are actually not sure who is in charge. The difficulty with coalition is that unless there is a formula that is agreed upon and that makes sense, somebody has to lead. And in this specific context, it looks like everybody is leading. And that's going to create a chaos and difficulties, especially for this young man and this young, probably talent politically, who may or may not necessarily be ready for the role. That is a debate for another day. But what is a bigger question is whether he's going to be in this position for at least another 6 months or at least 3 years. And that's how we should be thinking, at least 3 to 5 years. And in this specific context, honestly, it looks like the last time we've seen a mayor is in the era of Herman Mashaba and former Mayor Pakstow. It looks like we're headed for more confusion in the investor and traveler market, because those are the strongest proposition that you sell in Johannesburg around its image as this world-class African city.
And I mean, Tshepo, in terms of the fact that since November we've had 4 mayors, it was Mpopalatsi, then it became Dada Morero, then it became Mpopalatsi the very next week, and then last week we woke up to Tapelo Ahmad becoming our mayor. And you mentioned, for instance, the mixed messages that this will send to investors. And I guess my question to you is, do you see politicians, every single one of them, as a reputation expert? For me, as a Joburg resident at least, I don't look at any of the political parties in the city of Johannesburg and trust any of them because of what's happened in the last 3 months. So do you think that in terms of service delivery even, and do you think that as the leaders, as political leaders, any of them take seriously the implication that it has if Johannesburg is not stable for the entire country and actually the entire continent?
Well, the problem with our politics, coalition politics, in fact, is that there's very limited accountability. The political environment calls for individuals who actually only see accountability when they are in charge. And when they are not in charge, it makes things rather tricky. And in this specific context, you do see an attempt by political leaders to try and work together and create a posture. When you saw Premier Panyaza Lesufi actually trying to show some leadership and coordinate and bring people together to have a conversation. But unfortunately, politically speaking, the political people in the room are looking at it and thinking who's actually in charge. And the likelihood of instability and the likelihood of frustration by citizens is very high. In fact, I do not anticipate that the politicians themselves are going to do anything about service delivery. I think the city of Johannesburg would need to look at itself and say, do we have competent managers and administrators who can actually keep things running while we are going through this political chaos? Because it does come across like a short-term solution. It also does come across as something that's going to be so unstable that it's hard for anyone to imagine it being sustainable, especially because we don't know the plans yet. The new mayor is already calling and planning actually for his 90 days, the first 90 days to 100 days. But we don't know whether he'll actually see that through. And then there's a lot of perceptions around the fact that a few political parties in that coalition are actually driving a different agenda, and that probably is just a stopgap. We don't know those kind of facts. We can't predict the future. And the minute you can't predict the future is the minute you create space for uncertainty. And as I say, investors do not appreciate uncertainty, but also citizens prefer a degree of uncertainty. The people of Johannesburg deserve a little bit of stability and direction. And at this moment, that direction is lacking deeply.
Yeah, I mean, we could wake up next week to a new mayor for all we know. And that's when I come to you, Wayne, in terms of the fact that, as you mentioned, and you and I were talking earlier about the mandate of the electorate back in November of 2021 was not necessarily to have an Al Jamar run municipality, right? Because residents gave Al Jamar 1 seat in council. And therefore, it means that, they're showing us in our faces that numbers do actually count, and the fact that they can then negotiate themselves and with each other to decide on what to decide for us as residents. But, for me, I guess my question to you is what this might mean in terms of Tapelo Ahmad and the fact that Al Jamar has 1 seat. I mean, he might want to survive in that position as mayor, and therefore the negotiations then continue about his MMCs, the mayoral committee, his executive, and therefore it means there might be things that he needs to do for other political parties in order to stay in that position. Don't we risk that as well?
Yeah, just one slight correction, and this is the bit of good news I'm going to give in this segment for Al Jamar, is they've got 3 seats.
3,
just
okay.
One brief comment on Tapelo Ahmad. He started out in the EFF and then went over to the ANC. And very shortly after that, he joined Al Jamar, which is a stroke of brilliance.
Yeah, I understand his stint with the EFF was quite short.
And the ANC, and I don't think he would have actually come close to being mayor if he didn't jump ship to Al Jamar. So just quite an amazing story. But the ANC, the senior coalition partners, have got 30 times more seats than Al Jamar. EFF have more than 9 times the amount of seats. So when one looks at the numbers, you need 136 out of 270 seats to have a majority. With respect to Mayor Ahmad, and he's got to have to think about this every single day, if the ANC and EFF and Patriotic Alliance say, look, this guy's not doing his job, they can get rid of Al Jamaa without consequence. So Mayor Ahmad is going to have to establish himself from day one to say, look, I'm going to make a real concerted difference over here. You guys need me. I don't have that many seats. My party doesn't have that many seats, but I have the clarity of vision, I have the leadership, I have the passion to work with the bigger parties and turn the quagmire around in the city of Johannesburg.
Well, that still goes back to my question, Mr. Sussman, about whether or not, there will be favors that he has to do, Tshepo Ahmad, that is, in order to keep his position, favors that might not necessarily be good for the citizens and residents of Johannesburg, but because he needs to keep those seats, he ends up having to still negotiate in terms of who he chooses in his executive, according to, the demands of the people that put him in that position.
Correct. So what's absolutely key is that he tries and puts together a mayoral committee, which is best for the residents of the city. But certain parties will want certain portfolios.
Yeah.
He's going to have to manage this. He's not going to have any real allies. I don't think there'll be another Al Jamaa person in the mayoral committee. This is going to be very, very difficult. I mean, it's one thing, and it's a great moment in his life to don the mayoral chain of the economic powerhouse of Johannesburg, but he is going to be the only person in this mayoral committee. The ANC will have more seats in that mayoral committee. The Economic Freedom Fighters will have more seats in that mayoral committee. The Patriotic Alliance will probably have more seats. How is he going to lead with conviction when he knows that they can just chuck him out at short notice?
Yeah, and that's when you see all this negotiation that they're doing on behalf of the citizens, like I keep repeating. But lastly, to you, Mr. Sussman, for now, before I jump back to Mr. Matseba, what does this mean on a national level for South Africa? We're going into elections in less than a year's time, I believe, if we are going to go into elections in May next year. And, a lot of people are predicting that it might be a coalition on a national level. Now, if we're seeing cities such as Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni act this way, are we ready as a country to have a coalition government on a national level? We're going to have a new president every 3 months.
So I think we're bound to see this. This is why it is very important to watch Julius Malema's press conference yesterday. Something similar happened in Ekurhuleni. This means that in the National Assembly for the elections in 2024, all bets are off. Because if Tshepo Ahmad with 3 seats can become the mayor of Johannesburg, I'm sure that many, many people are thinking, let me form a political party. I might have 1 or 2 seats and hold the balance of power, and I might not become the mayor, but maybe I'll become the deputy president or the minister of foreign affairs. So what we need, back to what Mr. Matseba was saying earlier, is I think we need something which is more predictable. It is what it is, and Tshepo Ahmad has the confidence of his coalition partners to lead the city. But I'm worried about this becoming more of a routine in South Africa where we just do not have any idea who will lead our cities because of smaller parties saying, if we don't get X, then there'll just be chaos. So we're in for very interesting times.
Mr. Matseba, I want to go back to a comment I made a little earlier on. I mentioned, how important Johannesburg is as a city for the entire country and the entire continent. Would you agree that the instability, the political instability in this particular city will have detrimental effects on both the country and the continent?
Yeah, look, Joburg cannot afford not to succeed. And that's because if you look at the city itself, the Southern African region on the continent, SADC, heavily relies on Johannesburg for trade and investment. There's a lot of movement that happens between the city of Johannesburg and our regional partners here in the SADC region. And then, of course, there's a plethora of investments and trade that move around the continent through all the 54 member states of the African Union. Union. And so when you have an uncertain and an unstable and a politically unstable Johannesburg, you really have creating a situation where South Africa's economy is likely to bleed, because the contribution to GDP by Johannesburg is that significant. And importantly, the contribution of the city of Johannesburg around the continent is far greater and far significant to be undermined. And so we hope that perhaps as a starting point, that the political leaders will exercise some type of strategic restraint and actually allow for some degree of predictability and sustainability, because it's sustainability that's important. If we can't keep a leader and leaders in one environment, at least for a period of 3 years, you create a space for these instabilities where plans are created and they are thrown out of the window and recreated and thrown out of the window every single financial year. In fact, it now seems like, given the past 4 months, we are going into a terrain where we don't even complete a financial year, and that calls for a serious disaster.
Very quickly, my last question to the both of you. Just tell me, how many months are you predicting Thapelo Ahmed will stay in the position of mayorship? Let's start with you, Mr. Matseba. Just very quickly, your prediction of how long do you think he's going to stay in this position and why?
I doubt that he will stay for longer than 12 months at the worst, and at the bare minimum, 6 months would be too long. And that's because he has so many bosses to account to. And when you don't have a line of authority, you are going to have problems.
Exactly. And you, Mr. Sussman, what do you think?
The city of Johannesburg is absolutely key for the ANC in Gauteng in the race to 2024. I think the ANC wants him out of there within 3 months, and they want Dada Morero to return and become, I think, the 5th mayor, as you said, since the 2021 elections. The ANC needs to make sure that Johannesburg turns around. They are the largest party in the coalition. They need to take that mayoral chain from Mayor Ahmed as soon as possible.
I think, legislation should be looked at very quickly for there to be steps and guidelines so that we don't find ourselves in this position, especially on a national level. Thank you very much to the both of you. That was Tshepo Matseba. He is a reputation expert as well as elections analyst Wayne Sussman. Thank you, gentlemen.